The Subcommittee on Environment will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the Subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled An Overview of the Budget Proposal for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for Fiscal Year 2017. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank our witness, Dr. Sullivan, for appearing today before us to talk about the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's FY17 budget request. As a representative from Oklahoma, a state regularly hit with severe weather, it is my responsibility to my constituents to promote policies that improve our forecasting abilities in order to save lives and property. My constituents and the American people deserve nothing less. So I want to say that I am encouraged to see that NOAA has begun to utilize the growing opportunities that can bring a paradigm shift to the weather prediction landscape. This year's budget has a number of initiatives that I support. First, the budget requests an increase to the Office of Space Commerce. This office will be the place where private sector companies interact with NOAA through requests for information, proposals, data buys, and other partnerships. A properly staffed and funded office where the private sector can engage with NOAA is a vital component in a changing forecasting paradigm. Second, I was pleased to see NOAA request funding to continue the Commercial Weather Data Pilot Program authorized by H.R. 1561, the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act. This pilot program is an important signal to the private sector that NOAA is interested in new and innovative sources of data. Yesterday, we received the statutorily required report from NOAA detailing how the pilot program will be implemented, and I look forward to discussing that more during my questions. Third, I am encouraged to see NOAA incorporate a line item for the purchase of radio occultation data as a potential alternative to another constellation of cosmic satellites. This committee has conducted several years of oversight on various weather data sources and technologies, and we have found that GPS-RO is a very promising technology that has the potential to revolutionize our forecasts. I do have some concerns. Before any private sector providers can engage with NOAA, it must lay out how these processes will work. NOAA released its commercial space policy in January, a document laying out in very broad strokes how NOAA will utilize data acquisitions and other products from commercial companies. This policy was supposed to be quickly followed by a more specific process guide from NESDIS. We haven't seen that document yet. Finally, the budget request language for radio occultation data acquisition seems to call for the purchase of commercial data only if NOAA fails to acquire data internally first, meaning through the owning and operating of government satellite constellations. In budget language and staff meetings, it does not appear that NOAA is fully considering all the alternative sources. I disagree if this is the strategy. Private providers have already launched some GPS-RO satellites, and others have plans to launch this year and next. NOAA should consider this option on an equal playing field, not only after exhausting all other options. Private sector companies could improve our forecasting capabilities while also reducing the risk of a gap in our satellite data, an issue that has loomed over the agency for years. In the absence of action from NOAA, the House of Representatives continues to work with our Senate counterparts to bring H.R. 1561 to the finish line. This is bipartisan legislation which will statutorily compel NOAA to consider commercial data to augment our currently fragile satellite systems in orbit. This bill will also increase NOAA's ability to conduct cutting-edge weather research needed to move to a day where there are 0 deaths from tornadoes in this country. I look forward to discussing these issues and more today. I yield back, and I recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon, the ranking member, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this afternoon's hearing, and welcome back, Dr. Sullivan, and thank you for your service to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and to our country. I'm looking forward to today's discussion about the President's fiscal year 2017 budget request and NOAA's priorities in the coming year. NOAA is a critically important agency tasked with helping our communities, our economy, and our ecosystems remain healthy and resilient in the face of an ever-shifting environment. NOAA conducts state-of-the-art research to understand and predict changes in weather and the climate, as well as in the oceans and our coasts. This science is used to create products and services that inform decision-making by a diverse set of stakeholders, including emergency managers, farmers, pilots, and utility operators. NOAA is an agency that has a direct effect on the livelihood of all of our constituents. In Oregon, NOAA helps coastal residents decide when it's safe to go fishing, and if the shellfish they are harvesting or buying for dinner are free from harmful algal blooms. Their work supports the wine industry in Yamhill County, for example, as they grow grapes that become Oregon's world-famous Pinot Noir. And NOAA assists people in Oregon and across the country in planning for and responding to extreme weather events and natural hazards, like heavy precipitation, drought, earthquakes, and tsunami. Overall, I'm pleased that the President's budget request recognizes the importance of NOAA to the economic security of our nation. The budget request also recognizes that NOAA's critical mission of science, service, and stewardship can only be accomplished through a robust observational infrastructure. I'm interested in learning more today about the agency's progress in developing and launching the next generation of environmental satellites, its efforts to recapitalize an aging fleet of survey vessels, and NOAA's plans to speed the transition of cutting-edge research into operational use. Earlier this month, Oregon became the first state to enact legislation that would eliminate the use of coal-fired power. The law requires that Oregon accomplish this goal by 2035 and that the state double its renewable energy production by 2040. Oregonians know that climate change is the most significant environmental challenge of our time, and they want to lead the way as the nation and the world starts to shift to cleaner energy sources. So I'm especially pleased that the proposed budget recognizes the growing demand for climate data, especially at the regional level. The budget seeks to address this need for regional information and tools by expanding the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program into an additional regional and by serving new communities and regions where the program already exists. The proposed budget also seeks to improve our understanding of ocean acidification and the effect ocean health and climate variability can have specifically on fish stocks, but also on our economy at large. Many people fish for a living in Oregon, Washington, and other coastal communities, and this is something that's causing serious concern. In fact, regional fishery managers are considering a closure of Oregon and Washington ocean salmon fisheries north of Cape Falcon. The warming of the ocean has been devastating for salmon runs. The predictions for coho returns this year is half of last year's forecast. This is a problem for our ocean economy. According to the World Bank, more than 350 million jobs globally are tied directly to our oceans. Fisheries alone represent $108 billion a year in trade. In the United States, 58% of the nation's GDP, or $8.3 trillion, is generated by the counties that are adjacent to our oceans and our Great Lakes. Although I'm generally pleased with the President's budget request for NOAA, I will mention a specific concern. The Cascadia subduction zone sits off the coast of Oregon and off the northwest coast. It is not a matter of if, but a matter of when another earthquake occurs, triggering a massive tsunami with potentially catastrophic results. A researcher from Oregon State University, Dr. Chris Goldfinger, said, quote, "The gap between what we know and what we should do about it is getting bigger and bigger, and the action really needs to turn to responding, otherwise we're going to be hammered," close quote. Therefore, I trust you will understand my concern with the proposed reduction of the education and awareness grants through the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. These grants are designed to help communicate threats to vulnerable communities and to assist in the development of response strategies. We should not and we cannot neglect this critical last step. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for holding this hearing. I look forward to working with you and our colleagues to ensure that NOAA has the resources it needs to fulfill its missions in protecting life and property, and to getting some important legislation, like the reauthorization of the Tsunami Warning Education and Research Act and the Weather Research Forecasting Innovation Act, signed into law. I yield back the balance of my time.
I'd like to thank the ranking member from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for her opening statement, and recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith. And before doing so, I'd like to note that everybody on the Republican side other than me is from Texas. I think this committee is not sufficiently balanced appropriately for a guy from Oklahoma.
Where were you born?
Mr. Chairman, we will get you an application when this is over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are here to discuss the President's fiscal year 2017 budget request for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This year, NOAA's request comes in at $5.8 billion. While I support elements of NOAA's budget, other parts of the President's budget request cannot be justified. For example, the administration's request continues to increase funding for climate research at the expense of other important areas of research. This administration continues to prioritize climate funding over weather research. The President's budget requests $190 million for climate research, while only $100 million is dedicated to weather research. NOAA should fully fund weather research as authorized in the House-passed bipartisan Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act. It is NOAA's job to monitor the climate and disseminate data to the public. But under this administration, this usually takes the form of monthly news releases that fail to include all relevant data sources. For example, the agency often ignores satellite measurements, which are considered by many to be the most objective. NOAA and NASA both claimed, for example, that 2014 was the hottest year on record. However, scientists at NASA concluded that they were only 38% certain that 2014 was in fact the hottest year on record. NASA buried this statistic in a footnote to their report. Similarly, in 2015, NOAA and NASA's joint news release for the temperature of 2015 did not mention satellite data. However, a prominent satellite data set from the University of Alabama at Huntsville showed that 2015 was only the third warmest year on record, and another widely used satellite data set showed that 2015 was only the fourth warmest on record, contrary to NOAA's claims. The truth is that neither 2014 nor 2015 were the hottest year on record. Satellite data, which NOAA had access to, clearly refutes NOAA's claims. Likewise, a recent report presented at the American Geophysical Union and co-authored by the Texas and Alabama state climatologists has called into question the placement and quality of many ground stations across the U.S. The report concluded that this may have resulted in inaccurate temperature readings used by NOAA. Instead of hyping a climate change agenda, NOAA should focus its efforts on producing sound science and improving methods of data collection. NOAA should prioritize areas of research that significantly impact Americans today, such as ways to improve weather forecasting. Unfortunately, climate alarmism often takes priority at NOAA. This was demonstrated by the agency's decision to prematurely publish the 2015 study that attempted to make the two-decade halt in global warming disappear. The study, led by NOAA meteorologist Mr. Thomas Carl, used controversial new methods to readjust historical temperature data upward. The goal was clear from the start: remove a weakness in the administration's climate change agenda. This committee began an investigation last July to examine NOAA's use of data in this study, as well as their role in carrying out the administration's extreme climate agenda. The committee heard from whistleblowers that the study was rushed into publication and that internal debate was stifled before moving forward. Even more suspicious was the timing of this study. It was published just as the administration was about to propose its final Clean Power Plan regulation at the United Nations Paris Climate Change Conference. This controversial study appears to serve only one purpose: to promote the administration's drastic and costly regulations. Well-respected scientists have recently rebutted NOAA's claims. A new peer-reviewed study published in the journal Nature confirms the halt in global warming. According to one of the study's lead authors, it, quote, essentially refutes NOAA's study. The media were quick to cover NOAA's study last year, by the way, but the many respected scientists who refuted NOAA's claims were ignored by much of the national media, including the very same outlets that had previously reported that there never was a halt in global warming. To date, NOAA has failed to comply with a lawfully issued subpoena. Instead of devoting time and resources to misinform the public, NOAA should give the committee answers to our valid questions. NOAA should adhere to the scientific standards of being objective, independent of political considerations, timely, and having findings based on all available sources of information. Instead, NOAA ignores legitimate sources of objective information, such as satellite data, in order to promote the administration's biased climate change agenda. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll yield back.
I'd like to thank the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith, for his opening comments. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Johnson, for a statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Sullivan to the committee, and thank you for being here today to testify. As many of us know, NOAA's research and services play a critical role in weather forecasting, enhancing our understanding of the environment, and ultimately in helping ensure that the United States economy remains strong. A key aspect of those efforts is to work with NOAA, is the work that NOAA does to help us understand and address the potential impacts associated with climate change. Rising temperatures and sea levels and changes in ocean chemistry and ecosystems pose a real threat to public health. The management of our fisheries and coast and the overall resiliency of our communities to extreme weather changes and events. NOAA's programs and activities and the tools and information they provide are central to our ability to understand, adapt to, and mitigate the impacts of changing climate. The proposed budget request contains a number of programs and activities that will expand NOAA's capabilities and increase the resiliency of our communities. But I'd like to comment on one new initiative that I find especially promising. NOAA is proposing to develop and operate the nation's first integrated water prediction capability, meaning that NOAA wants to develop the ability to deliver street-level water forecasts to more than 100 million Americans. This level of detail and coverage could significantly improve our capacity to prepare for and respond to floods, droughts, and water quality hazards. Unfortunately, those of us from Texas have seen our fair share of both flooding and droughts over the last few years, and I'm certain that our local emergency managers and decision makers would have welcomed its capability. Overall, I'm happy to see that the President's budget request for NOAA emphasizes the agency's critical roles in improving weather forecasts and in helping the United States act on climate change. I look forward to discussing these efforts as well as the other important initiatives and programs that are contained in NOAA's proposed budget. Before I yield back, I'd like to address the majority's ongoing investigation of NOAA's climate scientists. It is clear to me that this investigation is unfounded and that it is being driven by ideology and other agendas. The majority has asserted, without offering any credible evidence, that NOAA and the climate science community at large are part of some grand conspiracy to falsify data in support of the significant role humans play in climate change. However, the overwhelming body of scientific evidence across many different fields has shown that this is not the case. There may be an ongoing scientific debate about the rate of warming over the last 15 years. But that does not change the basic facts according to science. The world is warming. The warming is caused mostly by humans, and there are significant risks associated with this warming. I hope my friends and colleagues on the other side of the aisle can move past this effort to create scientific controversy where it does not exist, and instead focusing on finding solutions to addressing the threat of climate change. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
I'd like to thank the ranking member for her opening statement. Our witness today is the Honorable Kathryn Sullivan, Undersecretary for Oceans and Atmosphere at the U.S. Department of Commerce and Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Previously, Dr. Sullivan served as Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction, as well as performing the duties of NOAA's Chief Scientist. She is a distinguished scientist, renowned astronaut, and intrepid explorer. Dr. Sullivan earned her doctorate in geology from Dalhousie University. I now recognize Administrator Sullivan for 5 minutes to present her testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Bridenstine, Ranking Member Bonamici, and members of the subcommittee. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss the President's FY17 budget proposal for NOAA. NOAA is one of the most valuable service agencies in the government. Americans rely upon our information and services every day, looking to our observations, forecasts, and assessments for the foresight and the reliable information they need to live well and safely on this dynamic planet. The severe storms and flooding in the South over this past week remind us all just how vital these services are. Our 17 budget request of $5.9 billion builds on the foundation established with the support of Congress to put this critical information into the hands of the public. Each of the proposed increases is a carefully chosen, targeted investment designed to meet the growing demand for services. My remarks today, I'll highlight just a few points. First, this budget invests in the observational infrastructure needed to protect public safety and welfare. To produce the weather forecasts our citizens, military, and the economy rely upon, we must ensure continuity of our satellite operations. The successful launches of Discover and Jason-3 and the upcoming launches of GOES-R and JPSS-1 are major milestones in this regard. We appreciate Congress's support for the Polar Follow-On program last year and now request $393 million for PFO and next-gen technologies that set the stage for improved forecasts in the decades to come. We must also invest in the fleet of ships that provide critical ocean observing capabilities. Without timely investment, our fleet will decline by 50% by 2028. We appreciate the $80 million Congress provided in the FY16 omnibus to begin recapitalization, and here request $24 million to complete design and construction of a regional survey vessel. Second, this budget focuses on community resilience. 2015 saw 10 United States weather and climate disaster events with losses of each one exceeding $1 billion. Recognizing this enormous impact, the budget invests in the services and information that communities need to assess their risks and minimize losses ahead of, during, and after such extreme events. And water is at the heart of many environmental threats. There's either too much or too little, it's in the wrong place, or it's of poor quality. NOAA is uniquely positioned to bring both new research insights and the operational predictions the nation needs to address the water challenges ahead. This budget includes $12.25 million to establish the Integrated Water Prediction Initiative, the heart of which is an enhanced river flood forecast system that will increase the number of prediction points nationally 700 times, from about 4,000 to nearly 2.7 million, making it possible for us to give street-level forecasts to 100 million Americans that lack them today. Third, this budget makes investments that ensure our National Weather Service is second to none. Weather and climate impact approximately a third of the nation's economy. They can cost billions of dollars and claim hundreds of lives per year. We remain firm in our commitment to build a weather-ready nation and provide citizens with timely, accurate, and well-communicated forecasts. Our budget request includes funding to extend the operating life of 2 critical ground observing systems, the NextRad radars, which support about 85% of all tornado warnings, and ASOS, which is vital to aviation across the country. Extending the life of these critical systems for a fraction of the original cost is wise investment. Finally, the budget aims to improve the operational core of this agency. To meet these national needs and give our customers the best service possible, we must have an adequate mission support infrastructure. I believe instead we are near a critical breaking point. For example, funding for our HR services has declined steadily since 2008, but the workload has risen. The result is a backlog of 1,800 vacancies and a level of churn in our human resources workforce that is twice that of other agencies. We must act now, and this budget requests $4.4 million to address the most severe mission support weaknesses. Finally, transforming the R&D of our world-class scientists into tangible benefits for the country currently takes far too long. To speed this up, we've developed a research transition acceleration program based on proven methods and best practices from NASA, the Defense Department, and the private sector, and propose to fund it at $10 million. In sum, NOAA's FY17 budget reflects our commitment to growing a strong economy that is built to last while being fiscally responsible and focusing on priority initiatives. I thank you.
I'd like to thank Administrator Sullivan for her opening statement. I remind members that the rules limit us to 5 minutes each for our questioning, and I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Administrator Sullivan, in December, before this committee, the head of your satellite office, Dr. Voles, testified that a more detailed process guide for how commercial companies will partner with your agency would be produced following the final commercial space policy. When I asked for a date, he testified that it would be released in January or February, and of course now we're past that date. He recently told my staff that the document was off his desk and now, quote, in process, unquote. I was just wondering if you might know where that document is now, If it's within NOAA, maybe it's elsewhere in the administration. If you could share any information you have on that.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. It is in final review within NOAA, is my understanding. That was our original target of the January date, and we share your eagerness to have it out. Our goal with both the process, the policy and the process, is to provide the private sector with both the policy clarity and stability that they seek, as well as the more detailed steps they need to follow, and the next beyond that will be the specific technical details for different measurement sets.
And would you be, can you maybe at this hearing provide us a date for when we might be able to get that?
I don't have a date certain at my fingertips,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, but I'll be happy to update my inquiry as soon as the hearing is over and
Okay.
get back to your staff.
That would be great if you could do that. Thank you. I'd like some clarification about the process by which NOAA will look to the private sector for radio occultation data. I'm encouraged to see the inclusion of private sector data options, but I am hopeful that NOAA does not see this only as a secondary option. Can you share with us how you see this process working as far as integrating commercial data into the data assimilation systems?
We see it as a very promising prospect and are moving accordingly to have the opportunity and the ability to test and evaluate it. It is a nascent proposition that the private sector can indeed provide such data. So the process and the procedures we're laying out here will give us the opportunity under the pilot programs to do the testing and evaluating that can confirm whether, in fact, the data quality and reliability meet the standards required to sustain the accuracy and reliability of our forecasts.
Okay. I've just got a few minutes here. Hopefully we can do a second round of questions. Contrary to what we have heard from numerous NOAA officials that have testified before this committee, I have heard from countless weather and data experts that World Meteorological Organization Resolution 40, WMO 40, does not require the release of all data to the world. In fact, it lists out specific types and in some cases amounts of data that is open for sharing. I do believe weather is a public good, and I understand the advantages the United States gets from our partnerships with other countries. However, there is a burgeoning weather satellite industry sitting on the sidelines because they are concerned that if they sell data to NOAA, you will turn around and give it away for free, which completely destroys the marketplace before it begins. I am not advocating for getting rid of WMO 40. I want to be clear about that. All I am asking is for us to actually abide by it. Will you commit to me that we can work together to craft rules for the treatment of weather data acquired from commercial space systems that does not undercut the emergence of a market while still maintaining that our government keeps its commitments to WMO 40?
Mr. Chairman, we have been working closely with your staff over the months that this issue has been evolving. I promise you we will continue to do that. And let me assure you, we're also working very closely with the WMO itself. I was just over in Geneva last week. The calendar is a bit of a blur, and met directly with the new Secretary General.
Thank you for that. I'll yield my time, or I'll yield my time back to myself, I guess, and recognize the ranking member, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to follow up on the chairman's comments. I hope that we can continue to work together on the Weather Research and Forecasting Innovation Act and find a way to get that through collaboratively. So I appreciate your willingness, Dr. Sullivan, to keep working on that. We know that the ocean is becoming more acidic as it takes up excess carbon dioxide from the air on the West Coast. It's been especially difficult for shellfish larvae, and oysters and clams are vulnerable as well. The budget request proposes an increase of $11.7 million for NOAA's ocean acidification program. I support this increase. I'm leading a letter asking the Appropriations Committee to fulfill it. Can you please explain the need for this program and its potential benefits, and also how NOAA is translating its ocean acidification research into practices and strategies that benefit the industry? And I do want to save time for another couple questions.
Yes, ma'am. I thank you very much for the question. We have heard loud and clear from constituents around all the coasts, and I would highlight in particular your state and Washington, about the need to expand monitoring for the water conditions for ocean acidification conditions. There is also still a considerable amount of research that needs to be done to understand the oceanographic processes and clarify and better understand the mechanisms by which changing ocean acidification may affect shellfish and finfish and other species of key interest. To your question about translating it to practical benefit, the increased monitoring and research would allow us to continue and deepen our work hand in glove with the shellfish industry in your state, for example, to make sure that we can give them the monitoring and early warning technologies that let them take actions on the farms to protect their larvae.
Terrific, thank you. It needs to be repeated that it isn't just the coastal communities that are affected, because people across the country buy and eat shellfish that are affected. There's also been, over the last couple of years, a significant number of harmful algal bloom outbreaks, the Great Lakes and coastal communities, for example. Now, I was pleased to work with Representative Posey to secure passage of the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Amendments Act in 2014. Now, NOAA is currently requesting an additional $4 million to continue to develop and operationalize forecasts of harmful algal blooms, hypoxia, and other pathogens. How will this improved forecasting increase economic security?
Thank you also for that question. We have developed through our labs the capabilities now to combine satellite measurements and in situ measurements in calculations that give communities such as the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast in particular days of warning about when you're going to have a bloom that is of a toxic species and that will reach a concentration that could jeopardize municipal water supplies or fish and shellfish or beachgoers. The time has come, those techniques are mature enough now to be sure that we can extend them to other coastal regions, because we are now seeing increasing frequencies of blooms across all of the United States coasts.
Thank you. And finally, in your testimony, you mentioned that NOAA's mission support services are at a critical breaking point. There's one human resources professional for every 148 employees, and that is peer agencies have nearly 3 times as much HR staff. You mentioned that this has impaired the agency's ability to fill the 1,800 empty positions. Can you explain how NOAA has sought to address these hiring shortages and what you need to ensure that our National Marine Fisheries Service, our Weather Service, and other NOAA entities have the employees and the employee support services they need to serve the American people?
Yes, it's a critical point, and the vacancies are concentrated in the National Weather Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. We have looked to separate the high-touch functions where we really need people talking directly to our scientists and managers from the more mechanical things that facetiously, let me say, typing up forms, and wherever possible, outsource that mechanical processing to other parties so that our team can work on the front end of things. We've engaged OPM, we've engaged the small business, and in parallel with those actions, because they've not been sufficient to begin to reduce the backlog, we've been working with the Department of Commerce on the development of a more robust shared services model that promises tremendous improvement going forward, provided we can make the transition to that model. The funding that we request for NOAA in this budget is really essential to continuing the contract services we have now in place and beginning that transition to the broader shared services model. It is our one pathway that offers the potential to get past this hurdle and back to where we have the full complement of expertise needed to do our mission.
Thank you. And I know and appreciate, as I'm sure my colleagues do, the importance of having dollars in the field and in the research. However, that being said, for you to be able to do the work that you need, you must have those support services. So I look forward to working with you on that, and I'm out of time and yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the ranking member, and I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Sullivan, thank you for being with us today. My first question goes to RICO, and it is this: have you or anyone you know been a part of any discussions about using the RICO statutes against anyone who might question some aspects of climate change?
I have been part of no such conversations, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. The Attorney General testified before the Senate last week that she had in fact been part of such discussions and had referred it to the FBI, but she did not consult with you, nor has anyone else at this point.
I have been part of no such conversations.
Okay. It's reassuring to hear, because I happen to believe that you shouldn't be prosecuted for disagreeing about climate change. My next question is this. You're familiar with NOAA's study, sometimes called the Carl study, that found that, or allegedly found, that there had been an increase in global warming over the last 18 years. That study was refuted by some well-respected scientists in an article that appeared in the publication Nature. I assume you've read the Nature article?
I'm familiar with that paper.
Oh, okay. Do you still stand by the Carl study's conclusions, or do you now recognize that those conclusions might have been weak and agree with the Nature scientist?
I welcome the debate in the scientific literature that the full publication of the data and information in the Carl paper has enabled. That is precisely what the scientific process
Right, but both
is
can't
designed
be,
to do.
both can't be correct. Do you feel that the NOAA study is still correct, or do you think the Nature article is correct?
If I recall correctly from the Nature paper, the authors of that study themselves say that the Carl study is a valuable scientific contribution.
That wasn't my question. My question goes to the 18-year halt in global warming. The NOAA study said that there had been an increase in warming during that period. The Nature article said there had not been. With which do you agree?
If I recall the original IPCC report from years ago that first used the word hiatus, that study also said that that did not contradict the fact that the linear trend of temperature continued to
Again,
increase.
I'm not talking about the linear trend. I'm talking about the 18 years. Do you agree that there was global warming, or do you not agree that there was global warming?
Mr. Chairman, I don't study the kinks and bumps in temperature curves at that level of detail.
The 18
more as a
years,
scientist.
18 years is important because a lot of studies said that there was no increase in global warming. You were one of the few that said there was. Again, I'll ask you the same question. Do you agree with the NOAA Carl study, or do you agree with the Nature scientist?
I stand by the quality and integrity of the scientific analysis that was published for all to challenge, confirm, or verify in the Carl study. And I'll be interested to follow the scientific debate as it goes forward.
Okay, so you still say that the Carl study was accurate and you disagree with the Nature scientist?
I stand by the integrity and quality of the Carl study.
Okay, I wasn't asking you about the integrity and quality. I assume that by that, though, you meant their conclusions as well?
I believe they did a valid job of analyzing new data sets. They proffered
That's all.
analysis and
Then that does answer my question. If you consider their conclusions to be valid, you agree with them, you disagree with the Nature scientist. If you want to be in the minority, that's fine. I just wanted to see what you felt on the record. My next question is this. To my knowledge, NOAA has not fully complied with our subpoena dated February 22nd. We did get some production 2 days ago, but it was not the full comprehensive production that we requested. Do you intend to comply with our subpoena?
Mr. Chairman, my staff continues to work on the details of these matters with your staff on an almost daily basis, and I assure you we will continue to move forward on the path that they have agreed to make sure that we satisfy your needs.
And so you do intend to comply in a timely manner?
We fully respect the committee's oversight responsibilities and have been working diligently since your very first letter to do precisely that.
And so is it fair for me to say that you do intend to comply with the subpoena?
We intend to continue working with your team to fulfill the request that you've expressed.
Okay, thank you for that. And yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back. I recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sullivan, as you know, the various regions of the nation, including my own, have been plagued with flooding and drought over the last several years. Therefore, I was pleased to see that the budget request included $12.2 million for a new water prediction initiative. As I understand it, NOAA plans to build up and leverage interagency efforts at the National Water Center in Alabama to create new and improved water predictions, forecasts, and warnings that will help local communities respond to and prepare for floods and droughts. Can you please provide me with a little bit more detail to this initiative? Specifically, how will the capabilities provided by this proposed initiative be different than the current service of NOAA provides?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. And maybe the simplest way for me to make that clear, I said some statistics in my commentary in my testimony about times 700 of the number of points and 100 million Americans. But, you know, a picture is often worth 10,000 words, and this is a map that shows the number of points that we currently put forecasts out for across the United States, those red triangles. That's the 4,000 points. Many of them are miles away from a downtown. They're on some run of a stream. The new model capability that we proposed to launch, provided we received the FY17 request, turns that to 2.7 million points. Well, what does that look like? It looks like that. It turns the map blue. It is almost contiguous coverage, like dropping a mesh over the country. And this means that in communities such as the ones in your area that were hit so bad just recently, the information about what will the water level be won't be a mile or two upstream where some main branch tributary comes in. It'll be in the neighborhood. It'll be right here where it matters to you. We have heard vividly from emergency managers across the country how powerfully important this would be to them in terms of their ability to better protect their citizens.
Thank you. As you know, the majority has been investigating a peer-reviewed climate research paper published by NOAA scientists in the magazine Science last year. And I understand that the paper adds to the scientific body of work examining the concept of a slowdown of the hiatus in the rate of global warming over the last 15 years or so. The majority has alleged that the publication of the research paper was in some way rushed and that NOAA did not adhere to the Data Quality Act or the agency's scientific integrity process. I know that you have commented some, but I'd like to also note that a separate scientific paper that included climate scientist Michael Mann, published last month, found that this hiatus was real, but was temporarily masked by natural factors. Dr. Mann, in a story about the paper, stated the temporary slowdown in no way implies that human-caused warming has ceased or slowed down. I point this out to show that it is part of the scientific process. Different scientists examine different parts of similar issues and rarely come to identical conclusions. This does not mean that scientists or others were involved in some grand conspiracy or for political reasons, as the majority believes. With that in mind, Dr. Sullivan, can you please describe the agency's scientific integrity process, and can you please respond to the allegations of which you, I think, just now?
Thank you. NOAA has a very strong and rigorous scientific integrity process that is very widely admired, called by many a gold standard. We uphold it very strongly, very firmly, myself, my chief scientist, our research council. And it insists upon integrity and independence of science throughout the agency. It includes clear protections to prevent political interference. And in this matter, Congresswoman, let me assure you, there has been no political interference. I had nothing to do with the timing of the report, so can't speak in detail to that. The final timing of the appearance of any publication is, of course, at the discretion of the publication itself. I do know in this instance the journal Science is one of the most highly respected journals globally, renowned for a very rigorous peer review process, and recognizing the interest in this matter, in fact, scrubbed this paper with extra diligence. But at the end, when a paper comes out, is dependent on the journal.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr.
I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Nagelbauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Sullivan, thank you. Could you hold up that last map that you had a while ago? Yeah, and so you're trying to turn the map blue, is that right, or are you trying to?
The blue color on this side shows the new density of points compared to just the red triangles.
Okay, because I like maps that we try to turn red. So in the future, if you want to.
You're asking that I reverse those colors?
Would you reverse the colors for me? Thank you. Thank you for being here. One of the things since I've been on this committee, and I had brown hair, I think, when I first got on this committee, but, you know, this satellite program has, you know, it's had its problems. Cost overruns, you know, delays in getting those satellites flying, and you know, it's consuming a fairly substantial portion of the budget, and you've asked for increases over the years. And I want to associate myself with Chairman Bridenstine in that I think it's to our benefit, the taxpayers' benefit, especially with the fact that the private sector has, you know, really enhanced, since I've been on this committee, their participation in space. And now we're using, you know, private companies to launch, I think, to take supplies to the station and so forth. What's your vision about the future? Sometimes, we have, quite honestly, the agencies are resistant to, bringing the private sector into that turf. That NASA was not hasn't been overly excited, as you know, in the past about, transitioning some of the programs to the private sector. But to me, it makes a whole lot of sense, because one of the things that the private sector has the opportunity to do is get some cost recovery, from some commercial opportunities with the data that they receive from the satellites. So could you kind of give me your Administrator Sullivan position on that?
We are quite intrigued. We watch the space sector evolve, as anybody does that's dependent on space-related data. In the weather domain, we believe it is a promising but still quite nascent prospect to actually have data flows from private sector satellites. There have been a number of claims. There is some hardware in orbit from at least one company that I'm aware of, but really nothing proven to the level that we require for ingesting something into the National Weather Service, because if we make a mistake on that, we then degrade the forecast that, in fact, Americans are depending on every single day. So our posture and our engagement with the private sector in this regard is just tempered by that concern to make sure we work together to define the best path forward that doesn't jeopardize the quality of American weather forecasting. I might just add, we work hand in glove with the private sector in the design, development, launching, and flight operations of our satellites today. Those are primarily private sector companies doing that work on our behalf. And across many NOAA mission areas, from weather sensors to tsunami warning sensors, technologies pioneered in NOAA labs, we willingly and eagerly transition to the private sector. So if another country wants to install a tsunami warning buoy today, they actually buy it from the SCIC company for just the reasons you said.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I would caution you, and it's again, is sometimes the requirements that we require of the private sector exceed those that we require of ourselves internally, and that's designed to, to make it difficult and to create any space for the private sector, with space not being a pun intended. But so I would encourage you as you move forward is that we have to bring those people in a collaboration. I don't think it compromises the mission at what's going on at NOAA, and I think it actually has an opportunity to expand that mission and to free up very precious dollars that we don't have of your budget. I think we're going to have to go borrow about 20% of that, and charge it to my children and my grandchildren. And they won't even be flying the same satellites, when it comes time for them to be utilizing that data. So I would just say from my perspective and from a fiscal standpoint is that I would encourage you to make opportunities for the private sector to do that and work on that red map for me too while you're doing it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I would like to just add, I think his points are right on point. When you think about data from the commercial sector, though, we don't have any way of knowing whether or not that data is as good or better than NOAA's data until we get that process guide so that we have the standards necessary to validate the data. So, and I know we're working on that, and thank you for that. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Barra, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the ranking member. Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for your service to our country and your service at NOAA. I often hear my colleagues say, well, they can't determine whether the climate's changing or not because they're not scientists. Now, I'm a physician by training. I am a scientist, not a climate scientist, but certainly trained in the scientific method and how you collect data. And at the surface, if we just think about it, 2015 was the hottest year on record by quite a bit. That's just objective data. And folks may say, well, that's not a trend. But 2014 was the second most hottest year on data. Again, objective data. 2010 was the third hottest year on record in recent memory. 2013 was the fourth. So, as a trend, it doesn't take a scientist to realize that the climate's changing, and we are experiencing, record heat wave after record heat wave. Let's drill that down to what it means to the people. In my own district in California and to our state, we're going through severe drought-like conditions that are impacting everyone, from our farmers to our consumers. Everyone's chipping in. In my own district, Folsom Lake, which serves close to 500,000 people in my community, rely on Folsom Lake for drinking water, for surface drinking water. It's been at record lows. And yes, we are having a wetter winter. We are having some snow. But what we realize, over the last 4 or 5 years is when we look up at the Sierra Nevadas, our snowpack has been disappearing. And much of that precipitation, when we get it, is coming down as rain, not as snow. This is a crisis situation. In my district, we rely on Folsom Lake and Folsom Dam to help manage both flood risk as well as drought risk. And as we go through a joint federal project that will give us much more flexibility to manage both these conditions, weather forecasting becomes increasingly important. And the investments NOAA is making in better forecasting so we can better manage our water in the lake, knowing when we need to increase flows to create more capacity, as also when we should hold back on water, knowing that those storms aren't coming. So I appreciate the work you're doing. I was reading about the Cray supercomputer and just managing the big data and all the points of data, and I'd be curious about the Cray supercomputer as well as other resources that NOAA has to help us better predict and forecast weather.
Thank you very much for that question, Mr. Rhodes. The supercomputing is indispensable to this work. As you can imagine, you have to measure the entire globe and ingest the data and then run the calculations that let us have the kind of foresight that you're speaking about. One of the exciting projects to me, very specific to your interests, is something called Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations, which our Weather Service with our research teams and our fisheries teams actually are pioneering out in the Russian River bases for just the reason you said. If we can tell a dam manager with the Corps of Engineers there's not some more rain coming for at least X amount of time, then they could hold the water that comes in a wave in an atmospheric river instead of letting water go downstream to make room in the reservoir. That has great potential to help add some precision and some greater margin to the water management in your state.
Thank you. And anything we can do to help better manage that, provide the funding, make sure when we're writing the manuals that help us manage these reservoirs, we're not relying on data from 30 years ago or 40 years ago. We're relying on the instruments that we have today, the tools that we have today. And again, in a state like mine, in a region like mine, where we have the dual risk of both flood and droughts, we have to have those tools. So we very much appreciate the work that NOAA is doing. We want to make sure as we update the manual for Folsom Lake and the management of Folsom Dam, we incorporate all that data and the forecasting data. And again, from my perspective, this is a reality that we'll have to deal with. The climate is changing. Managing these resources has incredible impact on individual lives, on our economy. And the more we can recognize that, the quicker we can recognize that the climate's changing, and we've got to manage this life-saving asset in water. The sooner we do that, the better off we'll be. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sullivan, are you a fisher person, I guess? Is that?
I was a fisher person of sorts when I was a little girl going with my dad, bass and trout fishing.
Freshwater lakes?
Mainly freshwater lakes, very occasionally offshore.
Good. I get some questions on red snappers, being from the Texas Gulf Coast. There's been some complaints about the data that's being collected, and your own testimony on page 3 says that the actual red snapper population has improved 30%. Generally, across the board, most all the stakeholders believe the data to be flawed. What steps have y'all taken to improve that data?
Mr. Weber, I don't have specifics about recent data improvement actions pertaining to Gulf snapper fishery right at my fingertips, but I'd be happy to get back to you on that.
Okay, that would be good. And then I was curious about one of the exchanges, I think, between you and Ms. Bonamici, that there was salmon fisheries going to be closed off the west coast because the temperature had raised. Is that right? Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of the detailed parameters
Okay,
involved.
all right, fair enough. Another, changing gears on you a little bit. Last year, NOAA requested money to start the Polar Follow-On Program, which you received most of the funding, $370 million. Again, this year, you're requesting funding for $393 million. And in the out years, you will be requesting about $500 million annually. JPSS and the GOESR programs have experienced cost overruns and launch delays, in addition to inclusion on the last two editions of the GAO's high-risk report. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of that.
How can we be assured that NOAA has taken actions to prevent these next Battlestar Galactica satellites you're planning from experiencing those same problems?
Thank you for the question. We did have some schedule and budget difficulties on both programs a number of years ago and have worked hand in glove with the contractors, redone schedules, refined the budgets, improved our internal program and process management, and substantially strengthened our satellite team. Both the GOESR and the JPSS programs have now been running on time, on budget, and holding their margins for 36 months each. The programs are sound, they are stable, and we have now the management capacity and program plans in place to be sure, for me to be confident, that we will execute well on PFO.
Do you anticipate them winding back up on the next high-risk report?
I can't speak for the General Accounting Office. It is certainly a risk. A gap in satellite data for weather forecasting is certainly a risk to the country that we are all keeping our eyes on. How GAO might classify either that risk or program management risks, we'll have to wait and see. But I have heard from our GAO examiners personally that they now regard the programs as well-run and well-managed.
Well, I thought the term Battlestar Galactica was an interesting term, so may the force be with you as you continue. Does the Polar Follow-On allow for any flexibility to take advantage of rapidly changing technologies and capabilities, or will the satellites we will be flying in the 2030s era, will they be using this old technology?
The Polar Follow-On program does two things, Congressman. It locks in some economic advantage to carrying forward existing instrument designs, which are very complex. And in a component of the program called EON Microwave, EON-MW, it does propose exactly what you're thinking of, to put a small down payment on an investment that other parties have done the first investment in, a technology that offers the potential to substantially change the cost parameters on our most important microwave sounding instruments so that we do have new capabilities that are more cost-effective in the future.
Is that the EON, are those the microwave sounders you're talking about?
Yes, there are.
Aren't there some private companies that are developing those?
I know of no private company that's developing the kind of radiometer that makes these precise vertical measurements to the depth of the atmosphere that these specific instruments do.
But you do know of companies that develop the microwave sounders?
Not sounders, microwave receivers that do things like the GPS radio occultation.
Okay, and have you checked with them to see if there's a plan and process for them to begin developing? Are you working with them hand in hand?
We are. We scout that sector actively. We stay engaged with the space community widely. The pilot programs that I've been discussing with the chairman give both us and the companies the opportunity to really explore and for us to co-invest in helping them actually demonstrate that they have the capabilities they've said to us they aim to provide.
Well, according to the National Space Policy of 2010, NOAA doesn't need to develop that technology. So the more you could do it from a private standpoint, I think it's kind of like what Congressman Nagelbauer was talking about, the more tax dollars we save. Would you agree with that?
If a technology exists and has been proven, I would certainly agree with that, but that is not currently the case in the microwave sounding arena.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The idea, of course, behind the commercial interest on this committee is sharing costs among the different commercial actors that want to buy that data, energy companies, transportation companies, agriculture companies, and ultimately then the government becomes one of many customers, and that reduces the cost for the taxpayer. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sullivan, NOAA independent review team recommended a gap filler mission as a way to help mitigate potential gaps in the afternoon polar orbit and make NOAA's polar satellite program more robust. What is NOAA doing to address this recommendation, and how are those plans reflected in fiscal year 17 budget requests? And are there any other options that NOAA is examining that can enhance the robustness and resiliency of the polar satellite programs?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Bateman. We have done a number of things flowing directly from the IRT's report. For one, we structured the Polar Follow-On program in a fashion that allows us to shift directions on that if need be and launch a gap filler satellite in the early 2020s timeframe. That was not the direction we were heading prior to the IRT's report, so they were very helpful input in that regard. The EON microwave request that is embedded within the Polar Follow-On budget line is another one of those examples. As I have indicated, it is an existing technology. We would propose to benefit from investments other parties have made in bringing it to its current stage, but to apply some NOAA investment to take it the next steps and really determine and confirm that it could meet the microwave sounding needs that we have. Should that prove true, and we're fairly confident that it would, then EON Microwave has a prospect to serve as a gap filler as well.
Okay, thank you. And then also, what are the key risks that could affect NOAA's costs and schedule commitments for the polar and geostationary satellites, and what is NOAA doing to address these risks?
Thank you for that question also. Some of the big risks that we had been prone to or vulnerable to in that, in fact, we've retired a little bit with the first-year funding for the Polar Follow-On program. Because one of the biggest risks when you need multiple satellites to provide the kind of continuity that we need in the weather arena is that you break production, and the companies, the private sector companies that are working on producing these, release their workforce, lose the tooling, lose the engineering expertise. So as the IRT also pointed out, we had basically been buying a satellite at a time, which is the least cost-effective way to do it. The Polar Follow-On program moves us back in a direction of a robust constellation by the early 20s and gets back some of that obsolescence and workforce and engineering risk that happens when you start and stop any complex program. So that is certainly one thing. We also internally have done a tremendous number of things to strengthen our internal processes and our management structure. We've worked very diligently with our colleagues at NASA who actually run the contracts and do the procurement for us, and with the contractors that they engage. And I think that the team now clearly, as demonstrated by several years consecutive strong budget and schedule performance, the team now is clearly well in hand and functioning on all cylinders.
Okay, and then what is the life cycle cost of the GOZAR program, and similarly, what is the life cycle cost of JPSS's program? How do these costs of these programs compare to the cost of our partners you were mentioning? Specifically, does the Department of Defense and our European partners, do they incur similar high costs?
I don't have all of those life cycle costs right at my fingertips, Congressman Babin. I do know the JPSS program life cycle cost remains steady at $11.3 billion. And again, I don't have Defense Department or European figures. I can tell you that they certainly are of the same order, as witness the European Commission's, European Union's recent launch of their Copernicus and Sentinel series satellites.
Well, I was just wondering if they've dealt with the same number of delays and cost overruns that NOAA has had. Do you know?
We are not out of family with agencies that produce large, complex space systems.
Okay. Then over the last few days, and you even mentioned this in your opening statement, we've seen devastating floods in the southern United States. In fact, I have 5 of my 9 counties that are in an emergency situation right now with an all-time record flooding of the Sabine River and flooding in the Neches and in the Trinity Rivers in Texas. As spring starts up this year, I'm concerned that severe weather outbreaks and tornadoes will again put American lives and property at risk. And I wonder, is it smart, when we look at the President's budget, to be cutting NESDIS, NOS, MOAO, and the National Weather Service? What do you think?
I'm confident that this budget makes the sound investments in the targeted places that are most central to public safety and the public welfare. and will not be leaving us short on those hazards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Texas. Regarding the distributed architectures that you talk about to mitigate risks, we fully support that. Polar follow-on is what you were describing. You could also do that through taking advantage of various commercial operators. The National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is doing that with remote sensing and imagery. And of course, communications is, the Department of Defense is using distributed architectures with communications by leveraging commercial as well. I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Chairman Bridenstine. Administrator Sullivan, the changing climate is already having visible impacts around the country. Perhaps nowhere is this change more apparent than among our coastal communities, which remain vulnerable to increasingly severe storms, rising sea levels, and altered marine ecosystems. I am pleased to see that the budget request reflects NOAA's commitment to enhancing the resiliency of our coastal communities. Can you please describe in more detail how the budget request will improve the resiliency of coastal communities, including the $15 million increase NOAA is requesting to expand its Regional Coastal Resilience Grant Program?
Thank you very much for that question. I can perhaps best illustrate the vital need that you're referring to by the experience we had with the $10 million we were given for regional coastal resilience grants in FY15. We received 196 proposals from communities across the country for those dollars, for a total amount of $151 million. We were able to fund only 6 programs, 6 proposals out of that entire set, but those 6 proposals are enabling some 100 communities to look at their vulnerabilities, the hazards that they are exposed to, and really begin to lay in concrete plans and take concrete actions from habitat restoration to shoreline protection to natural infrastructure to put themselves in a better footing with respect to the changing conditions that you cite. And that's why we're asking for an increase in that funding line this year.
And these communities are all, well, they're on the coast, of course, but they...
All across the country.
Yeah. Well, the budget request, I want to talk about polar orbiting for a moment. The budget request includes an increase of $8.1 million to explore options for the acquisition of radio occultation data from the polar orbit. This includes sustaining the international partnership with Taiwan to build the second set of sensors and evaluating the possibility of purchasing commercially available data. Can you begin by describing the value of this data and what the impact would be of losing this capability?
Thank you for that question. This radio occultation data is a very valuable augmentation of the high precision sounding that we get from the instruments aboard our weather satellites. It helps calibrate and take out bias and inaccuracies that sometimes get into those other data sets. We've kept the door open to possibly going with the government solution, the cosmic solution, for the simple reason that as I sit here today, that is a technically proven, known system. We know the data quality characteristics of that system. It would be what we've seen in orbit now with the predecessor. So that is a bird in the hand that we know the quality and characteristics of. As the chairman has noted, and as we are committed to, we do propose in this budget to proceed with pilot studies, working collaboratively with the private sector, co-investing in the test and evaluation needed to confirm whether the data sources that they propose to offer do in fact live up to those same quality standards.
But there would be, would there be a significant, how can I say this? I mean, the fact that the uncertainty about whether the private data sources are reliable, what would that pose in terms of if they were not reliable? What would that present to us?
If you look at all of the data streams that go into contributing to the quality and reliability of weather forecasts today, the radio occultation measurements rank quite high in the top 6 or so of those data sets. They are valuable. We would not want to lose radio occultation.
So an interruption in reliability would be a significant problem for us.
It would be a concern.
And then you describe how the evaluation of purchasing commercial radio occultation data through this request. What can you describe how the evaluation of purchasing commercial radio occultation data through this request will work in comparison to the commercial weather data pilot program. Will this effort be distinct?
It will follow the ground rules and guidelines that come from our policy down to the process that is soon to come out and into the detailed technical specifications about particular data types, so about the GPSRO. So the industry knows they have a stable governance environment for working with us, but they also know what the particulars are that they're aiming at in terms of specifications.
Well, thank you, Administrator. I appreciate your answers. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We're going to go for a second round of questions. If it's okay, I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes and then the ranking member for 5 minutes. Real quick, the stage that I think needs to be set is one of national security. In the last Congress, Chairman Wolf mentioned from the floor of the House that the National Weather Service got hacked into. He attributed it to the Chinese, and it compelled NOAA to shut down some satellites for a period of time. It wasn't too long ago, I think it was in 2007, the Chinese used a direct descent anti-satellite missile to shoot down one of their own satellites in low Earth orbit. The reason I think it is important for us to take advantage of commercial is quite frankly to very quickly disaggregate and distribute the architecture as you have rightly identified as one of our goals. One of the challenges to rapidly distribute the architecture is being able to buy data from commercial. It's why we are doing it in the Department of Defense. I'm also on the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces on the Armed Services Committee, and we deal a lot with the communication architecture as well as remote sensing and imagery. This is why this is important, taking advantage of commercial. It not only complicates the targeting solution for the enemy, but also they have to invest a whole lot more money to jam or hack into numerous different ground architectures as well. So it changes their calculation for how much they have to invest and those kind of things, and it could actually deter them from making those investments to begin with. This is why it is so important that we correctly interpret WMO 40. And because if the commercial industry believes that the data purchased by NOAA is going to be given away to the world for free, then they won't create that data to begin with. And if they don't create the data, then it's not a global public good because it's not a good at all, which is a concern of mine. One of the areas we've been looking at is how do we comply with WMO 40 and at the same time make sure that we're not destroying a market that would otherwise exist. Some of the areas we've talked about are resolution restrictions. If commercial operators are going to invest in new instruments and technologies and capabilities that is of higher resolution than what the government is building itself, then maybe we can protect that data and not give it away for free to the world and prevent that market from forming. Also, we've talked about data tiers. Maybe the first 20,000 radio occultations can come from Cosmic, and beyond that, there'd be another tier of data where we can augment our systems with even more radio occultations. And of course, we've had testimony on this committee indicating that more occultation, there is no limit to the benefit of more occultations. We need more and more and more, and it gets the models better and better and better. And in some cases, we can actually lose some of the primary sensors when you have that much radio occultation data. And then, of course, time delays. Certainly, the data doesn't have to be shared to the world immediately, but maybe if we delay it for 24 or 48 hours, we can create the market and be in compliance with WMO 40. So I wanted to talk to you. You mentioned that you had talked to folks in Geneva regarding WMO 40. Can you share with us what their thoughts were on it and kind of the direction they're thinking about going?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I have not been in discussion at this level of detail about particular tactics or methods with the Secretary General. He doesn't operate at that level either. But to the point of confirming that the world is changing, there are interesting and different prospects emerging. You know, the arrow of time only goes in one direction. We all know that. And that it's important that we find ways forward that engage with and understand and explore these new prospects.
Right.
And also that we do that in a way, to use an engineering term I know you'll understand from your pilot background, let's make sure that we do a make before break connection. Like an astronaut with a tether or a mountaineer, these data are valuable to forecast today, as I know you appreciate very well. Let's make sure we've got our hand firmly on a real replacement that we know brings the same or better value before we let go of this one. The policy framework we've set out, the process we hope to bring to you shortly, and the specifications that we'll set up, the conversations we've had with industry on this subject have all been with that motivation.
Thank you for that. And just so you know, on the armed services side, we're working with the Department of Defense. They're looking at commercial data buys as well to help accelerate this process, again, for national security reasons, which is a good thing. I want to switch gears real quick. I want to talk about spectrum. As I understand it, the administration has asked federal agencies to identify areas of spectrum that could be utilized for other purposes. There's a slide up. I just want everybody to take a look at it. It is also my understanding that weather data streaming from satellites to ground stations could be severely impacted if required to move or share spectrum with other users. Obviously, when we open up spectrum and we share spectrum, we can jam ourselves. And I think NOAA and this committee are going to be in agreement that the last thing we want to do is release spectrum to be used by other operators that would hinder our ability to predict severe weather. When you look at this slide here, you can see the areas that have been blacked out because of interference from other people using the same spectrum. Does NOAA advocate for moving or sharing spectrum when it comes to our weather satellites?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say at the outset how much we appreciate your keen understanding of this interest and its potential impact on our mission. We support the President's policy to recognize the growing arena of broadband in the world that we live in these days, but we do support ensuring that there is a clear and established process, realistic timelines, and that we NOAA are provided the means and the time that might be needed to provide what adjustments or protections prevent this sort of interference happening. I know you have heard we're seeing interference even at one of the test sites where there is a pilot test of an exclusionary zone. We're still seeing that kind of interference from sources that are up to 100 miles away.
Over-the-horizon communications for the Department of Defense these days overwhelmingly is commercial. About 80% of it is commercial. That's within, a lot of it is within the Ka frequency spectrum. And in fact, the 5G networks are looking at maybe not cannibalizing, but sharing more of that 5G or more of that Ka spectrum. And it's very dangerous for the warfighters because ultimately they're the ones that need the information and they need it complete and they need it when they need it, and we don't need to be worrying about interference. With that, I will yield back the negative 2 minutes that I've taken and recognize Ms. Bonamici for as much time as she may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I just want to follow up on your last 2 minutes that you yielded back because I think that this challenge of the spectrum is something that we can work together on a bipartisan basis with NOAA to make sure that that challenge is met, because we certainly don't want interference, and there does need to be a process. I do, even though Mr. Weber's no longer here, want to respond to his comment for the record. I did mention in my opening statement that there are some regional fisheries managers in the Northwest considering a closure of Oregon and Washington ocean salmon fisheries in certain areas, in large part because of the weak forecasts for coastal coho salmon, to which is attributed warm water in the ocean. So I want to thank you, Administrator, for including in the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research section the climate competitive research on the impacts of climate on fish stocks. I think that research will be very helpful to the industry. I did want to follow up as well, Dr. Sullivan, on the comment that I made in my opening statement about the concern about the reduction of the education and awareness grants through the Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program. We found that different coastal communities are not only different in their topography, but also have different communication needs, different awareness needs, depending on how far it is to get out of the tsunami inundation zone, or how flat the ground is. There's lots of factors, and the grants are really designed to help communicate threats, especially to vulnerable communities. So can you talk a little bit about why that reduction is included in the budget?
Thank you, Congresswoman. That budget does, that request or that proposed change does request some of the just hard choices we have to make to try to live within our means. We have many such programs that we know provide valuable information that communities use to address their resiliency and their protection from the specific hazards that they're facing. In this particular case, our judgment is that the Tsunami Ready program that runs in each community through our weather forecast office provides an avenue to meet that need.
Thank you. I hope so. It is really a serious issue with the coastal area. And it's be hard to explain to my constituents, but I will look forward to working with you on that other program and hope that that is sufficient to meet the needs. The committee's also been interested in increasing the transition of research conducted in the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Office to the National Weather Service. This is something that the chairman and I spoke about when working on the weather forecasting bill. It appears that some real progress has been made between those line offices, and I'm pleased that the budget request includes $10 million to accelerate the transition of research to operations across NOAA. So can you please describe how NOAA plans to accomplish this goal, and will this address the need to accelerate the transition of research from the academic community and the private sector into NOAA operations, and if so, how?
Thank you for that question. We've seen some great advances in our operational products in recent years. The high-resolution rapid refresh model, which gives 4 times the resolution on the ground, is one example. But that took almost 10 years to get into operations. And there are a couple of factors in play that this budget proposes to address. One is shifting our high-performance computing models from stepwise acquisitions to lease structures, which is one of our proposals. Lets that capability evolve more seamlessly and more smoothly. But this program, the RTAP program, addresses the other problem. What we learned as we canvassed NASA and DOD, DARPA, and private sector entities is good work that sits here on the research bench or in the journal ready to go and pertinent to certain needs doesn't get transferred across on its own. Magic does not happen. It takes a dedicated funding line and an intentionally built program structure, such as the Defense Department has, to reach into the research arena, knowing what a need, an unmet need is, and help co-invest in the transition of that work to refine it and tune it precisely to the operational needs so it can pay that dividend to the warfighter or to the citizens. We worked carefully. My chief scientist has a background at the Office of Naval Research as well as earlier experience in NOAA. We have laid out the administrative structure, we have laid out the competitive guidelines, we've adopted the technology readiness levels, all of the structure needed to make sure that our researchers see how to move things along and our operators see where to reach. And with this budget, we propose to start exercising those mechanisms at the $10 million level. The first round, should the Congress give us this appropriation, we would focus internally to make sure we get the training wheels really run in. But it is absolutely then our intent that this is the technique we can use to harvest from NSF or DOD or anywhere else where there's promising work that we could put to the benefit of the American people.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to thank the ranking member, and of course, everything you just mentioned from my constituency perspective, moving from a day where we have warn-on detection to warn-on forecast is critically important to my state of Oklahoma so we can get higher lead times for tornadoes and other things, so thank you for that. I'd like to thank the witness for her valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from the members. This hearing is adjourned. Thank you.